In the year 1889, far beyond the reach of the growing cities, nestled within the shadowed hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, a family lived in a manner that defied every expectation. The mother, scarcely taller than a child, measured only 4 feet, delicate in her form, yet carrying a presence that drew the eye of anyone who caught a glimpse. The father, in sharp contrast, weighed nearly 485 pounds, a man of extraordinary size and strength, moving through the mountains with a quiet, deliberate patience that seemed at odds with his own enormity. Together, they created a household that would perplex and confound every doctor who ever attempted to understand them. And then there were the children, born into this household, under circumstances that left those who studied them questioning the very nature of human possibility. What you are about to hear is a chronicle of a family that history recorded, but science could not fully explain. It is a story of extremes, of human life at the edges of what was considered possible, set against the backdrop of a wild and remote land, where the mountains hold secrets older than the towns themselves. These children, and the home in which they grew, would come to challenge the understanding of every physician who visited, every neighbor who whispered about them, and every visitor who dared to approach the remote cabin in the Appalachians. The story begins in a place where the air itself carries a weight of isolation, where the trees rise like silent sentinels, and where, for a family such as this, ordinary life was a concept that did not exist. To truly understand the story of this family, one must first understand the land they called home. The Appalachian Mountains stretch endlessly across the eastern United States, a tangle of ridges and hollows, covered with thick forests, where the sunlight struggles to touch the forest floor, even at midday. In 1889, these mountains were not merely a backdrop, they were a world apart. Towns were small and scattered, roads were little more than dirt paths, and the isolation was profound. Communication with the outside world was slow, often taking days or weeks, and the lives of the people here were governed as much by the land itself as by the people around them. Life in the Appalachian hollows was harsh. Winters could be brutal, with snow piling in drifts that made travel impossible, and summers were heavy with heat and humidity, the dense trees and undergrowth seeming to close in on the small homesteads. Families relied on what they could grow, hunt, or gather. Outsiders often regarded the inhabitants with a mix of curiosity and caution, for those who lived here were self-reliant, accustomed to laboring long hours in near-constant isolation, and in some cases, to dealing with circumstances that would challenge the strength of the human body and mind. It was in such a place, amid the mist that never seemed to lift completely from the hills, and under the canopy of trees that darkened the sky even in the afternoon, that the family lived. Their home was a small cabin, modest and functional, constructed from the timber of the surrounding forest. Smoke from a single chimney rose steadily into the sky, marking their presence in the valley below. To any casual observer, it would have appeared unremarkable, a typical dwelling among the scattered cabins of the hollows. But for those who would come to study the family, the appearance of normalcy was deceptive. From the outside, the cabin seemed quiet, almost ordinary, yet the people inside were anything but ordinary. The mountains themselves, rising steeply behind the cabin, seemed to frame the home as though it were set apart from the rest of the world. Streams cut through the valley nearby, the sound of water running over rocks mixing with the rustling of leaves in the ever-present wind. The air was thick with the scent of pine, damp earth, and smoke from cooking fires, a mixture that would be forever associated with the house, in the memory of anyone who ventured near it. Neighbors in the valley had long noted that the family was unlike any others in the area. While most families here had children who grew up to be strong and capable, these children, though outwardly human, seemed to follow patterns and behaviors that defied expectation. Few dared to ask too many questions, for the family, while not openly hostile, had a presence that discouraged intrusion. And those who did approach carried with them a sense of hesitation, as if the mountains themselves were urging caution. The remoteness of the area amplified the sense of isolation. The nearest town was several miles away, over rough and uneven terrain. Horse-drawn wagons struggled to make the journey, and mail arrived infrequently. In such a world, a family could exist largely unseen, their habits and circumstances a matter of speculation among the few who occasionally glimpsed them from a distance. It was within this landscape, so unforgiving and so removed from the wider world, that the story of this family began to unfold, drawing the attention of those who sought to understand extremes of human existence. Physicians, scientists, and curious townsfolk alike. And it was precisely this combination of isolation and extremity, the strange contrast between the mother's diminutive form and the father's immense presence, that made the family an object of fascination, and eventually a subject of formal inquiry. Because here, in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, the ordinary rules of life seemed to bend. What would occur within this cabin, and the nature of the children who were born there, would become a case that doctors would discuss for years, a puzzle that no amount of measurement or observation could fully resolve. It was in this quiet, hidden corner of the mountains that a story of human possibility and human mystery would take shape, a story that would test the limits of understanding, the patience of observers, and the very definition of what it meant to be human. Within this isolated cabin, surrounded by the towering ridges and dense forests of the Appalachian Mountains, lived two individuals whose very presence seemed to command attention, even from those who had only glimpsed them from afar. The mother was a woman of remarkable smallness, standing no more than 4 feet tall. Her stature might have seemed fragile, yet there was a steadiness to her movements, a quiet assurance in the way she carried herself. Her hands, delicate and nimble, worked with care to maintain the household, to prepare food over the hearth, to mend the clothing of her children, and to manage the day-to-day tasks that isolation demanded. There was a rhythm to her life, methodical and precise, that seemed almost as if she had adapted herself entirely to the demands of the wilderness. The father, by contrast, was of extraordinary size. At nearly 485 pounds, his form dominated the small cabin, and his steps were deliberate, measured, and resonant. He moved with a quiet control, a patience that spoke of someone used to managing not only his own extraordinary weight, but also the complexities of daily survival in an environment where every task required strength and endurance. Despite his size, he was not clumsy. Those who encountered him at a distance described the way he could appear suddenly in the clearing near the cabin, surveying the land, and then retreat without a sound, a figure as imposing as any tree in the surrounding forest. Together, the couple presented a stark contrast, a living paradox, one so small, the other so large, each complementing the other in ways that few could immediately understand. To the neighbors, this contrast was impossible to ignore. Whispered remarks carried through the hollows, comments on the mother's diminutive form, the father's immense presence, and the appearance of the children who followed them. Yet the family was not cruel, nor were they openly unfriendly. Their life was quiet, structured, and self-contained. But it was precisely this quietness, this careful self-containment, that fueled curiosity, and in some cases, unease. Visitors who approached the cabin, whether out of scientific interest or simple curiosity, often remarked upon the careful organization of the household. Nothing seemed out of place. Meals were prepared with precision. The children, when present, were attentive and responsive, though their appearance and proportions would later puzzle even the most experienced physicians. There was a sense of order to the household that suggested discipline, care, and an almost deliberate management of every aspect of daily life. It was a family that seemed to exist in its own rhythm, separate from the wider world, yet tethered to it by the occasional visitor or wandering neighbor who dared approach. Yet it was the children, born of these two extremes, who would ultimately define the family's place in history. Even before their arrival, the contrast between the parents created a tension, a question that lingered in the minds of those who observed the household. How would such extremes come together? What form would life take for the offspring of such a pairing? And when the children did arrive, the answers, at least according to conventional understanding, were as perplexing as they were extraordinary. For the couple, life continued in quiet determination. The mother, tending to the domestic tasks of the home, maintained a constant watch over her children, guiding them carefully, ensuring their survival in a harsh, remote environment. The father, moving through the surrounding land to gather resources, hunt, or tend to the needs of the family, carried the weight of both his own body and the responsibilities of maintaining life in isolation. Together, they managed a household that seemed improbable in its very existence, a household that would soon attract attention from the outside world, not for ordinary reasons, but because the children born within would challenge the understanding of anyone who studied them. Neighbors, though wary, occasionally observed the couple interacting. The mother's movements were precise and thoughtful, while the father's presence commanded attention without words. It was in these quiet, almost mundane moments that the extremity of the family became apparent, not through spectacle, but through subtle observation. The contrast was undeniable, yet it carried no overt drama. It was a matter of presence, of proportions, and of a life lived in the folds of the Appalachian wilderness, entirely apart from the conventions of ordinary society. It was in this environment, shaped by isolation, extreme physical contrasts, and a careful management of daily life, that the stage was set for what was to come. A series of births, a lineage of children whose existence would perplex the local population, challenge the understanding of physicians, and leave a record that, even decades later, would remain a subject of curiosity and careful examination. The parents, in their quiet endurance, in their stark contrasts, had created a setting where the ordinary rules of observation, expectation, and understanding were insufficient. And so, the story of their children, the events that would unfold in that small cabin, and the impressions left upon those who sought to study them, began with the remarkable presence of two people who, together, formed a household unlike any other in the mountains or the world beyond. As time passed, the couple's family began to grow, and with each child born, the quiet hills of the Appalachians became a little more attentive, a little more aware of the household hidden among the ridges and thick forests. The births themselves were unremarkable in the sense that children arrived as they always did. Yet those who observed the family, either from a distance or through the cautious visits of local physicians, quickly realized that what emerged was far from ordinary. The children, unlike the majority of their peers in the valley, displayed characteristics that left even the most experienced observers uneasy to describe. Their proportions, movements, and features were inconsistent with the understanding of human development at the time. They were alive, breathing, and growing, yet every measurement and observation seemed to defy expectation. Doctors would later attempt to document each child meticulously, noting that while none were incapable of normal life, each seemed to occupy a space that straddled the boundary between possibility and the unknown. Neighbors, though largely kept at a distance by the parents' quiet insistence on privacy, could not help but notice the unusual nature of the children. At certain times of day, as sunlight pierced through the canopy of the surrounding trees, brief glimpses of the children moving about the clearing seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the human form. Shadows and angles played tricks on the eye, and yet the effect was consistent. Those who observed these moments would recount them later, often with hesitation, describing a sense of difference that could not be dismissed as imagination or exaggeration. Local curiosity began to grow, though it was tempered by a sense of caution. The children did not present a danger, nor did the family seek attention, but their existence alone created a tension within the community. Conversations in the valleys would sometimes drift toward speculation. How could such extremes produce offspring at all? How had nature allowed for this pairing? And what could possibly be expected of the children as they grew? For those willing to linger on the question, the answer was elusive, and that elusiveness contributed to a quiet, sustained unease. Physicians who eventually made the journey to the remote cabin approached with a sense of scientific purpose. Their curiosity was professional, but it was accompanied by the undeniable weight of the unknown. Measurements were taken, careful notes recorded, yet with each observation, the sense of anomaly grew. Children who might otherwise have appeared ordinary were noted for inconsistencies. Limbs longer or shorter than expected, coordination that seemed almost preternatural, and behaviors that, while not harmful or malicious, suggested an underlying pattern that no medical text could account for. The parents, for their part, maintained a careful balance. The mother supervised, guided, and nurtured with remarkable patience. The father's presence was both protective and commanding. He allowed the physicians to examine the children, but remained quietly observant, as though measuring both their intentions and their reactions. The household functioned smoothly, yet the undercurrent of difference, the subtle irregularities that defined the children, was impossible to ignore. Rumors among the neighboring families began to solidify. Accounts described moments when the children appeared unusually aware of their surroundings, responding to events before they occurred, or moving in ways that seemed synchronized beyond coincidence. These observations, passed along in whispers, were never fully verified, yet they persisted, adding to the sense that the family existed in a quiet tension between the ordinary and the inexplicable. Even within the walls of the cabin, the children displayed a strange awareness. They were attentive to their parents' instructions, their movements careful and deliberate, yet observers often noted a peculiarity. They seemed to move with a precision or understanding that suggested intelligence beyond what could be measured simply by age. Nothing about this behavior was overtly alarming, and nothing was dangerous, but it contributed to a sense of the extraordinary, a sense that the household itself was a living question that refused to be answered. The environment, combined with the family's uniqueness, created an atmosphere that was both normal and abnormal simultaneously. Life proceeded as it always had. Meals were prepared, chores completed, children learned, and time moved forward. Yet the awareness that observers carried, the subtle sense that the family occupied a space slightly removed from the conventional rules of life, never left them. Each visit, each observation, and each whispered conversation in the valleys reinforced the mystery. By the end of these early years, it became clear to those who studied the family that the story of the children could not be reduced to ordinary explanations. There was a pattern, a regularity in the irregularity that defied contemporary medical knowledge. And as the children grew, the quiet attention of neighbors and doctors alike continued, each new observation deepening the sense that something extraordinary, something that challenged the boundaries of understanding, existed within that small Appalachian cabin. By the middle of the year in 1889, word of the family had reached the nearby towns. Physicians, scholars, and a few brave souls intrigued by reports of the unusual children began to prepare journeys into the Appalachian wilderness. They were not motivated by fear or morbid curiosity, but by the pursuit of knowledge, a desire to understand what seemed impossible to reconcile with the medical understanding of the time. The journey to the cabin was arduous. The doctors traveled for hours over uneven terrain, through thick forests where sunlight rarely pierced the canopy. Streams and rocky slopes slowed their progress, and even the most experienced guides spoke in low tones of how the mountains seemed to test anyone who entered. The isolation of the area became increasingly apparent. The farther they traveled, the more the world they had known seemed to slip away, leaving only the trees, the wind, and the quiet promise of discovery or disappointment. When the cabin finally came into view, it appeared unassuming, almost ordinary against the backdrop of the towering ridges. Smoke rose from the single chimney, and the faint sound of children's voices drifted through the trees. Yet there was a weight in the air, a sense that this home, while simple in construction, contained a presence that demanded attention. The doctors approached cautiously, making note of every detail: the layout of the land, the organization of the yard, and the small details that hinted at the household's way of life. Inside the cabin, they were met with a quiet order. Meals had been prepared with care, and the children, when present, observed their visitors with a calm attentiveness. The mother moved with precise, deliberate motions, guiding the household with practiced efficiency. The father's presence was palpable, his massive frame filling the space, even when he remained largely still, his eyes watching with measured scrutiny. Though the family offered no overt hostility, there was an unmistakable sense of awareness, as if every action of the visitors had been anticipated and quietly monitored. The doctors began their examinations slowly, recording measurements, noting proportions, and making detailed sketches. Each child presented anomalies that could not easily be explained. Limbs, stature, and coordination fell outside the norms of medical expectation. Yet none of the children were incapacitated or ill. They were alive, responsive, and intelligent, yet each observation seemed to raise more questions than it answered. The physicians, experienced in the study of human variation, found themselves confronting circumstances that challenged the very limits of contemporary understanding. Even as the doctors worked, subtle observations continued to accumulate. The children moved with a synchronization that was difficult to define. Their attention to the parents and to each other suggested a level of coordination and awareness that could not be accounted for by ordinary means. Small gestures, fleeting glances, the alignment of steps across the cabin floor, all of these seemed deliberate, almost instinctive, yet no one could determine the origin or explanation for these patterns. The parents, meanwhile, remained composed, offering access to their children while maintaining a quiet supervision that was at once protective and instructive. The mother guided the household, ensuring that the children followed routines without distress, while the father's presence alone seemed sufficient to keep all activity contained within the bounds of order. For the doctors, the contrast between observation and control, between anomaly and normalcy, deepened the mystery. Outside the cabin, the mountains continued to assert their presence. The wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and pine. Birds called from hidden perches, and the occasional movement of wildlife reminded the visitors that they were not alone. Yet the focus remained entirely on the family before them. Every new measurement, every note taken, every sketch completed, seemed to emphasize the strangeness of the situation. Nothing prepared the doctors for the full scope of what they were witnessing, and even after days of careful observation, they found themselves recording more questions than answers. By the end of the initial visit, it became clear that the family could not be understood through conventional methods alone. The children, while seemingly ordinary at first glance, displayed patterns of growth and behavior that defied expectation. The parents, in their quiet coordination and control, provided a home in which these patterns could exist and persist. And the cabin itself, though modest, seemed to contain an equilibrium, a careful balance of forces that made ordinary understanding inadequate. The physicians departed with journals filled with meticulous notes, sketches, and observations, yet no resolution. They had come seeking understanding, and while they documented the family in precise detail, the questions lingered. How had these extremes come together? What forces, whether biological, environmental, or otherwise, had shaped this household? And what of the children? How would their lives continue in a world that could not explain them? These questions, unanswerable at the time, would continue to echo through the valleys of the Appalachians for decades to come, leaving a legacy of curiosity, fascination, and quiet unease. Word of the family had begun to spread beyond the immediate hollows of the Appalachian hills. In the nearby towns, the reports of a tiny mother, an enormous father, and children that defied expectation became a topic of hushed conversation. The locals were cautious in their discussion, careful to avoid ridicule or disrespect, yet curiosity and unease mingled in every remark. The family's household had become, in effect, a focal point of speculation, a living question that the townsfolk struggled to answer. The stories told varied depending on the observer. Some spoke of the children's movements, noting their unusual coordination or the way they seemed unusually aware of their surroundings. Others recounted fleeting impressions of proportions that appeared inconsistent with ordinary development, moments that made a simple glance seem inadequate to capture what was happening inside the cabin. There was a quiet fascination, tempered by a sense of distance. Few dared to approach directly, and those who did were cautious, careful not to overstep the boundaries set by the parents. Local opinion began to divide. Some residents viewed the family with admiration, marveling at the parents' ability to manage a household under conditions that would test any family. The mother's care, the father's vigilance, and the children's adaptability were all seen as evidence of endurance and resilience in an unforgiving environment. Others, however, could not reconcile the accounts they heard with their understanding of ordinary life. Questions circulated about the nature of the children, about what might cause such differences, and about whether this household represented an extraordinary case of human variation or something else entirely. The physicians who had visited the family returned to the towns with detailed journals, sketches, and measurements. These documents, intended to record observations scientifically, fueled further curiosity. Copies and notes circulated quietly among local doctors, scholars, and educated townsfolk. While no conclusions were drawn, the detailed records reinforced the sense that this was no ordinary family, that the patterns observed in the children were both real and inexplicable. Rumors grew, as is often the case when observation encounters the limits of understanding. Whispers spoke of children moving in ways that seemed synchronized, of their attentiveness to subtle cues from the parents, of behaviors that suggested knowledge or awareness beyond what was expected for their age. Yet even these accounts, passed along cautiously, remained anecdotal, offering hints rather than confirmation. The community, aware of the limitations of their own observations, relied as much on stories as on experience, and in doing so, the family became a presence larger than their physical household, a topic of speculation in the valleys, a mystery that persisted in conversation and in the mind of anyone who had glimpsed the cabin from a distance. The tension, however, was not marked by hostility. The family was respected in the sense that it was understood they wished to live quietly, without intrusion. The parents maintained their household with a careful rhythm, and the children followed their guidance precisely. The sense of difference remained, but it coexisted with normalcy. Observers could note the extraordinary without feeling threatened. They could sense the unusual without finding fault. Yet the accumulation of these observations over time had an effect. The household became an anomaly in the collective consciousness of the surrounding community, a subject of ongoing fascination and study. As months passed, the pattern became clear. Physicians returned periodically, neighbors observed cautiously, and the family persisted in their secluded life. The children grew, and with each passing year, the gap between expectation and reality widened. For the townsfolk, the presence of the family was a reminder that even in the midst of ordinary life, markets, farms, roads, and schools, there existed realities that defied the ordinary. The mountains themselves seemed to frame this household as a space apart, a quiet reminder that human experience could reach levels of extremity that science had yet to understand. It was in this context, a combination of isolation, observation, and the gradual accumulation of subtle differences, that the family's story continued to unfold. The community's fascination was not born of fear alone. It was born of recognition that life, in its most remarkable forms, could exist quietly and almost invisibly, just beyond the edge of comprehension. And as the physician's notes circulated, and the stories of neighbors persisted, the question remained: what would the children become? And what truths would their lives reveal to those who sought to understand them? The answer, as yet, was unclear, and it would be some time before anyone could draw even the faintest conclusions about the extraordinary household hidden deep in the Appalachian hills. As the years progressed and the children grew, the observations of those who had encountered the family began to accumulate into a record that was both meticulous and unsettling. Physicians returned repeatedly, sketching, measuring, and noting behaviors, yet each visit seemed only to deepen the mystery. The children's growth did not follow patterns recognized in any textbooks. Measurements that should have correlated with age and development seemed irregular, yet consistent in ways that could not be ignored. It was during one such visit that the full weight of the family's peculiarity became most apparent. The doctors arrived at the cabin, notebooks in hand, prepared to conduct detailed observations. The parents welcomed them without hesitation, though always maintaining a quiet authority over the household. The mother moved through her daily routines with precision, attending to meals, the children, and the maintenance of the home. The father's presence dominated the space, commanding attention even in stillness, a silent observer of every action within the cabin. The children, now older, exhibited behaviors that were difficult to define. Their movements were deliberate and coordinated, their attention unwavering, their responses precise beyond expectation. Observers noted that the children seemed to anticipate events before they occurred. An object moved before anyone could reach it, a gesture completed in exact harmony with another. These were not actions of mimicry or learned behavior. They were subtleties that the physicians could not quantify, yet could not dismiss. It became increasingly clear that the household operated as a single, cohesive unit. The parents' influence was undeniable, shaping the environment and guiding the children. Yet the children themselves displayed a collective awareness that seemed almost independent. Their interactions were fluid, each response measured, each motion perfectly attuned to those around them. The physicians, despite their expertise, found themselves recording events that challenged the very foundations of their understanding of biology and human development. The atmosphere within the cabin during these observations was charged with quiet tension. The family moved with an economy of motion that suggested instinctive synchronization. The children would glance at each other in ways that implied comprehension beyond what could be explained by age or experience. The parents, while never commanding overt attention, exerted influence simply by being present, guiding the household with a combination of subtle gestures and quiet authority. Every movement, every interaction, contributed to a sense of cohesion that was remarkable and, for those observing, profoundly compelling. Outside, the mountains remained a constant presence. The wind through the trees, the distant call of birds, the occasional movement of wildlife. All were reminders that the family existed within a larger, natural world. Yet within the cabin itself, the patterns of life were extraordinary. Observers could note the precision, the responsiveness, and the consistency, yet the origins of these patterns remained opaque. The family existed in a space where the ordinary rules of observation, expectation, and understanding were insufficient. Physicians struggled to reconcile their notes with the reality before them. Measurements of stature, weight, and proportion revealed irregularities that were subtle but consistent. Behaviors that should have appeared sporadic or random were marked by repetition and coordination. Even the children's reactions to new stimuli suggested an intelligence and attentiveness beyond what could be readily explained. Each new observation raised further questions, deepening the sense that the family occupied a realm of existence slightly removed from ordinary life. By the end of the visit, the doctors were left with journals filled with detailed sketches, annotations, and measurements, records that would later be referenced for decades, but without answers. The family, as they had done for years, continued their daily routines, unaffected by the scrutiny, operating according to a rhythm and structure entirely their own. The parents' guidance, the children's coordination, and the cohesion of the household created a reality that resisted explanation, a living example of human life existing at the edge of understanding. The observers departed the cabin with the weight of uncertainty pressing upon them. Each note, each sketch, each recollection contributed to a growing record of anomaly, one that would puzzle generations of scholars and physicians. Yet no conclusion could fully account for what had been witnessed. The family, in their quiet routines, their careful interactions, and the extraordinary behaviors of their children, remained beyond the reach of ordinary comprehension. The mountains continued to rise around the cabin, indifferent to human curiosity, while the family persisted, an enduring testament to the complexities and possibilities of life itself. As the years passed and the physician's visits became more occasional, the family settled further into the rhythms of the Appalachian hills. The children grew with remarkable care under the watchful guidance of their parents, each developing according to the subtle patterns that had so intrigued observers. Yet no visitor, however experienced, ever departed with a full understanding of what they had witnessed. The journals, sketches, and careful measurements documented countless details, but the essence of the family, their cohesion, their unusual development, and the precise awareness of the children, remained beyond comprehension. The mountains, as they had for generations, continued to surround the household with silence and seclusion. Streams flowed through the valleys, wind rustled through the dense trees, and wildlife moved undisturbed, seemingly aware that this household operated under its own rules, in harmony with the natural rhythms of the land. The family's life appeared ordinary in its daily tasks, yet extraordinary in the precision and balance of their existence. Observers could describe what they saw, but the full story, how the extremes of the parents came together to shape these children, and why their development challenged even the most knowledgeable physicians, remained unresolved. For the townsfolk and the few who had ventured near, the family became a presence both familiar and mysterious. They were remembered in conversation, their home spoken of with careful attention, and the children recounted in stories that emphasized patterns, coordination, and subtle differences rather than spectacle. Over time, the family receded further from view, their daily lives continuing quietly, leaving behind only the traces noted by those who had observed them. The physicians who recorded the family's details left with a profound awareness of their limits. They had documented measurements, behaviors, and interactions, yet they had not explained them. Each record, each journal entry, each careful sketch only reinforced the sense that human possibility extended beyond the ordinary, that the lives of this small mother, her enormous husband, and their remarkable children existed at a threshold of understanding that remained unbridged. And so the family persisted, quietly and consistently, within the Appalachian hills. They became a story carried in memory and in writing, a subject of fascination, and a challenge to the assumptions of science. Though decades would pass, and though knowledge of human variation would continue to expand, the questions raised by this household remained unanswered. For those who had encountered the family, the impression lingered that in this small cabin, in this remote valley, a life had existed that tested the boundaries of comprehension and left an enduring record of human resilience, cohesion, and mystery. It is a story that endures, quietly embedded in the folds of the Appalachian wilderness, reminding us that even in the most familiar settings, life can exist in forms that defy expectation, and that the limits of understanding are often only revealed when one observes closely, patiently, and without presumption. The Appalachian hills still hold their secrets, and the story of this family remains a quiet testament to the mysteries of human life. What became of the children, how their lives unfolded, and whether their extraordinary patterns persisted, these questions remain unanswered, lingering in the valleys and forests where they once lived. If this story has captured your curiosity, share your thoughts below. What do you think shaped this family, and what lessons might their lives hold about the limits of human possibility? Subscribe for more stories that explore the hidden corners of history and join us as we continue to uncover the remarkable and the unexplained.